I will be fairly brief on a huge topic of increasing importance, natural disasters. And as you know, the story of natural disasters go back to ancient history. And in biblical times, Noah's Ark and the rising floods that lasted for 150 days is a story that people go back to and mention. These floods were of biblical proportions, and this was used in the case of the Thailand's floods last year. So we start with a few slides, and they go in the order of identifying the issue, and then go into some findings, especially from evaluation, and then what the implications might be, particularly for ADB. And well known to us, but the fact that this had a figure of $46 billion in losses from one source strikes you as extraordinary. It's a huge part of the global loss in a given year in a country. The floods in Thailand and the East Japan Great Earthquake, those two, along with previous incidents of Australia's floods and so on, have dominated the news in Asia. The cost of human lives, about 20,000 people, including 3,000 missing in the case of Japan, and continuing losses to the economy and the world are known to all of us. And we look at this with tremendous human and economic eyes and concern. Now, the stakes for Asia in particular, I want to make the point, are high. This is a very successful region, and we project the economic growth and well-being of Asia, sometimes almost as though they are going to be automatic. The main message of this presentation today is that when you look at the numbers and the emerging trends, nothing is automatic. So here, again, going back to the Thailand case, because that's the one that comes closest in my mind in terms of affecting the economic projections we make about the economy. So far, it's all about, well, this has been costly, let's fix it, etc. Now, we are beginning to get indications that growth projections cannot be taken as they are unless one builds in the human and the economic costs, as in the case of Thailand. Just imagine if there were three events, and statistically and from the meteorological point of view, there is absolutely no reason why three couldn't happen in the same year. What if 3 Thai floods occurred in the same year in Asia? We do stress tests of the financial crisis possibilities, and it's absolutely important to do that, even though we don't know for sure exactly what would happen. If we did a stress test on this, how will Asia cope? Supply chains, particularly as shown in the Thai example, food prices, highly vulnerable, and as I said, I think it connects back to the central concern of poverty reduction coming through growth rates. Asian growth will likely be hard hit with the potential for global contagion. Why do scientists say that these are all not science fiction but reality, possibly? Here we have, again, we don't have time to go into the statistical qualifications for any slide like this, but just at a very general level, a story from 1970 to now tell us about the rising trend, but note that the trend is really about hydrometeorological events. It's not so much about the more geophysical ones. Okay? So in the first couple of slides, we saw the enormous human toll of both floods and earthquakes. That remained the same. The reaction and the action needed for that remained the same. That said, when we look at the emerging trends and possible worsening of those trends, it's really more about the hydrometeorological phenomenon. And that's why in the rest of the presentation, we focus a little bit more on the disaster risk associated with that phenomenon. Essentially taken from the IPCC's model, 3 sets of factors, just to simplify, connect to the degree of disaster risk. And those 3 are intuitively exposure, just the fact that you have a lot of people exposed to a disaster could turn a hazard into a disaster. Their vulnerability, how heavily, densely they are populated, and how well off they are in terms of what they have of housing and so on, and how they can withstand a disaster, intuitively is a second big factor. A given hazard in a poor area could turn into a disaster. And then here comes the third matter of concern, and it is from the early times a change that we observe, and lots of scientific evidence now point to that, weather and climate related events that pertain especially to the hydrometeorological events, not the geophysical ones. I wish we had time to go into this, because some reaction on the completeness of this, the redundancy of this, etc., lie at the heart of the findings that I will turn to now. So, in connection with an evaluation, my colleagues are here. Tomo is here, Tuts is here, Tulsi is here, Ruth and others. So this evaluation on natural disasters, I think, typically does and rightly look at the reaction to a disaster. But from the earlier page, we thought that it is clear that the degree of the disaster results from exposure, vulnerability, and climate. If that's the case, here is a spotlight on one of those, a huge amount of work on the other two I won't talk about today. Please assume that that's there. But on the factors explaining risk to intense climate-related disasters in Asia, we repeat here the three factors of exposure, vulnerability, and climate remain our concern. And on those, summarizing a whole body of findings into one short slide, exposure, sure, is a huge factor. The population exposure in every one of the sub-regions that we looked at, statistically significant and quantitatively important in terms of explaining how much risk and how much damage were suffered. Vulnerability, yes, equally significant in some areas. High population density and low income was especially important in the case of Southeast Asia. You can tell me if that's intuitive, but Southeast Asian countries are hit particularly when they show high population density and low income in withstanding. And climate, its effects come up much more clearly at the sub-regional level. It's the temperature anomalies that show up very significantly in East Asia, and it's the precipitation deviations from the average that show up significantly in South Asia and Southeast Asia. But in this business, in this sort of thing, with this kind of data set, to find this evidence, I think is quite striking that it would show up so clearly in a 50-year time frame. Just always keeping in mind that 50 years, go back to the Noah's Ark story, it's part of a huge time series data set that we don't have, or they are significant in talking about this. So all the degrees of uncertainty remain. But I'm saying that under the lamppost we see this. And that's quite striking that all three factors are important. Complementing that, a much bigger exercise in a different way, but not with the same spotlight on Asia that we were able to put, tell us that climate extremes have changed since 1950. Extreme anomalies seem linked to specific weather patterns and global warming. This is for the first time that the scientific community has actually linked extreme weather to climate change. And in this case, I like to probe this further, but to specific weather patterns. I mean, that seemed something that scientists were not willing to say until very, 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 very recently. And the projections just follow from that. If the current business as usual continues, then what would happen in the future? So back to Asia Pacific, a little bit more on the findings that I mentioned. What is the most clear pattern here is the rising trend in temperature. So the increase, of course, if you look at this in a way, one can say, wow, that's half a degree is 1 degree. Is that a big concern? In 50 years, if it goes up by half a degree, well, that we can manage. So I quote from a paper my daughter wrote for a class in the 8th grade. Some might dismiss the increase of a few degrees as not doing much harm. But as with body temperature, a few degrees of increase cause very high fever. And taken at the level of the planet, scientists say that this trend continuing will put us into an ice-free planet by 2025. So this is serious, although it's small numbers. 100 to 101 degrees is a big deal. Again, to be complete, the precipitation, you don't see in the Asia-Pacific region a big increase in the average levels. Even here visually, you can't see a lot, but when we dig more deeply, especially at the sub-regional level, the variations have gone up. And that's what matters for disasters, right? I mean, it's not that the average numbers are a little higher, it is the extremes are worse. And that there is more and more compelling evidence that that's happening. So coming closer to home, this is the typhoon Ketsana Ondoi, which arguably showed the worst side of floods in a metropolitan area in recent times. A month's worth of rainfall in a single day washed away homes and flooded large areas, killing hundreds and stranding thousands. Behind that, the question can be asked, what is going on in the Philippines? I mean, Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries. Manila is one of the most vulnerable cities in the world, and certainly within East Asia. So what about the climate trends? This does point to, in a reasonable time series, rising incidence of more hot days and less cool days. Again, it's very important to go from the anecdotes. We say, what yesterday was the hottest day that I've had, but that's an effect of a lot of factors, including how you felt that day in terms of stress. But this is a little bit more compelling than anecdotal evidence. So, coming to ADB, coming to Asia and action and policy implications, how do we put this together? Exposure, vulnerability, and climate, all three important in varying ways, different in different sub-regions. How do we think about it? IPCC has put this model up, and I say that this is just one of the ways of doing it. It is not the last word. But if you were to take this seriously, its implications are a little different from what development organizations are doing and what countries are doing. Countries are doing a lot of things. In Asia in particular, there are a lot of good examples, from China to Japan to India. There are good examples of actions being taken. But this calls for a different scale of action. And what does that mean? We won't have time to go into great details. It's a bit subtle in the sense that they've put a triangle. And the triangle means that, of course, on adaptation, that is, take the trends and then adapt. That's here, doing more. And on mitigation, that is not take the trends as given, influence the trends. And then a combination would be that and this combined. What do you think will be the impact of natural disasters on development, right? That's the meaning of this graph. So the easiest thing to notice is that if we did nothing of both, right? No adaptation, no mitigation, the impact would be the greatest. So that's clear. But here it also says that if you did only adaptation, 100% adaptation, no mitigation, there is no effect on the impact either. It's like saying that if you mop up the floor but don't turn off the tap, you can feel very busy, but it has no effect if the tap continues to rise. Okay. But what is the ideal scenario? In this story, it is a combination of adaptation and mitigation that puts us somewhere there. And one needs to do both in cost-effective ways. And cost-effective ways because there is an opportunity cost for any action, and development is a result of not just doing what you can on natural disasters, but also on all the other top priorities that we have. So given that emphasis there, a look at the carbon path connects to the mitigation story. So just a slide on that. It is important for us to keep in mind the different ways of looking at carbon intensity. Countries look different on the total from per capita to the efficiency of production. Okay? We don't have time to go into what is better or worse, but I just think it's important to look at all three aspects when comparing the big countries. Why the big countries? Because they obviously are the largest contributors. These slides will be available so we can scrutinize them later. In the remaining 3 minutes on ADB's own actions, I think if you look at the natural disaster portfolio, here is the result of the tsunami, right? And then the 2011, that arguably some say was for natural disasters, even a more difficult year for the world. ADB's portfolio of about 1.5 billion. Again, we can argue about the exact definition. I know it's very interesting. What is disaster portfolio? Does it include this, that, and the other? But roughly speaking, if that's the case, then would that be about 10%, roughly? So that is an emphasis of importance. So given the significance of the issue, there is a focus in ADB on the topic. Breaking it down, you may not be able to see it at the back, but there is a combination of actions that take a response to the disaster seriously, and some building in the prevention side as well. So evaluative lessons relating to that go the following way. I'm just going to go quickly down this. Rising disaster damage has made the response in terms of risk reduction an integral part of development, not an afterthought, but one that we need to address if development is to be effective. It is important to consider the sources of the disasters, and the geophysical versus the hydrometeorological distinction I made is very important, both to understand, but also the nature of the damages are very different. The geophysical can cause a lot more human losses in terms of deaths, and the flooding can cause a lot of damages in terms of livelihoods, Pakistan versus Japan, and so on. And the third point is where I want to spend 2 seconds. The traditional response in natural risk reduction work has been to respond in terms of reconstruction and relief. Relief less and more on the side of the charitable agencies, but it must be coupled with prevention, including mitigation and adaptation, if we take the previous findings seriously. So if I have to give away one message, that is the message. It needs to be both response, but as we respond, build in prevention. Otherwise, we'll be mopping the floor again and again, if those trends are true. And then finally, on the lessons, for greater effectiveness of that type of a response, combining mitigation and adaptation in prevention, going along with reconstruction, so that's the basic approach, it should not be one-off, and we have lots and lots of examples from other parts of the world as well. Rebuild a road, no follow-up, the same road in Honduras got hit again. Or build some flood protection, build some agricultural work without the flood protection in Haryana, so one wasn't complemented by the other. So one-off as well as one separate from the others are problematic. And that also means that some multidisciplinary focus would be essential. And given that degree of complexity, the feedback from stakeholders really make the response much better. Communication is critical because, as I said, the sources and the causes as well as differences between disasters, and so how you respond to that is very important that the public understand. Australia has now these inundation maps which show how low-lying areas are hit differently and how badly. It's changed the consciousness in Australia already. So very final slide then simply says what we have already said. For ADB and the countries, continuing to build in disaster implications into the growth projections and not take them as automatic, make risk reduction integral to country and ADB strategy. That also requires that cross-disciplinary and teamwork, in the sense that someone working on mitigation on the adaptation side should be thrilled about someone working on mitigation and energy efficiency, and vice versa, because what one does really helps the other. It's like working on MDG 4 is so much helped by the ones who are working on MDG 2, but we often work in silos, and so that is a clear indication. And the third one, here it's put a bit strongly, but I would say complement the focus on relief and reconstruction with prevention and preparedness. One without the other is just not going to do it. And then public and private partnership. This is not all about the government doing more. And then it is linked to the global effort. Asia is a big player. No longer is a price taker. Asia is also a price maker. And so the link between country and regional and global are central. Thank you very much for your attention. Very much look forward to your comments.